Johor Darul Takzim, you can really hold your heads up high, even though you are eliminated from the AFC Champions League Elite Quarterfinals. Menyisakan very agonizing Sabtu 2 kalah to Al-Ahli of Saudi Arabia, the defending champions of Asia's highest level of club competition. So close, yet so far. And also plenty of lessons learned in this. You can say this is a very insightful game for all to see. And still, it's well done to Cisco Munoz Southern Tigers for giving their all for all they can do in Jeddah for that quarterfinal to keep it as close as possible against one of the top teams in Saudi Arabia, running them close before losing with their heads held up high. There's no shame in defeat. Tiada rasa malu. Tada. It's 100% performance, even the loss of gyro after that overhead kick by that Saudi defender who eventually got sent off. It was a shame that he could not continue for the rest of the game after contributing to Johor's only goal of the quarterfinal. But still, in all these 90 minutes, in you can say Johor's milestone moment in their club history, where they reach the quarterfinals to be among the best 8 clubs in Asia in the Continental Premier Club competition. And this is a milestone, the quarterfinals that Cisco Munoz and his coaching staff and the players have reached in spite, I think, after many coaches have come and gone, dominated the Malaysian scene, but failed to reach this new breakthrough that they have managed this time. So overall, still well done to Johor Darul Takzim, but it this game also showed us quite a few things. It is pretty clear that Cisco Munoz had to field the lineup he did, and even the substitutes that he had to throw in. He knew this former Watford manager knew very well that this is a very high stakes game where really you do need the best to really come in. And because of the rules that allow for unlimited limited foreigners, and this applies to the starting 11, I know for those pro local fans, it's a bit disappointing that there were no Malaysian born players who featured on this game tonight. But Cisco had no choice. His team had a game plan that is a massive departure from how they have played in Malaysia or even in the ASEAN Club Championship, Shopee Cup, or even in the relatively easier games in the ACLE League phase this season. But this is a high stakes game. One game, Sabtu winner, menang or kalah, menang stay in Jeddah or Saudi, kalah go back home, balik kampung. So Cisco had to fill the lineup he did. And it's pretty clear why Cisco chose it, because he knew that Johor were the underdogs. He knew that the Southern Tigers were up against the defending champions. They know that they cannot afford to play the same way that they would have done typically in Malaysia or even in Southeast Asia. Tak boleh. That will be suicide. So he had to play in a game in a way where they have to use where these players that he picked had already had their brains on because of their football education before coming to Malaysia many years ago. Their brain is already up there in playing football, and especially against the type of opponents, their first ever opponent against a Saudi club, where you need the brains, especially with Al-Ahli boasting the likes of Riyad Mahrez, a former main contributor of Leicester City's only Premier League title win in the 2010s. Then you got Edouard Mendy, the Al-Ahli goalkeeper captain, who made a few big saves to ensure that the defending champions would live to fight another day. Then you got Galeno, who had spent a substantial period of his career at Portuguese giants Porto and scored that wonderful winning goal. You can't help but to applaud. Bagus goal. It's commiserations for Zubair, who can't do anything despite being fully outstretched. That was that little edge in class, that little edge in quality, the quality of even those imports, those foreign born players that were fielded tonight against Al Ali for the Southern Tigers. It's still not enough. You can see the difference. I mean, I already mentioned those a few key players from Al Ali, and including the guy who scored the equalizer, Frank Kessie. He had actually played for AC Milan and Barcelona of Spain. Yes, so you can see that these guys have been exposed to elite level club football before coming to Saudi Arabia. Then you have in contrast, only Nacho Insa many years ago had played at the highest level in European club football for Valencia, but that is more than 10 years ago. And the closest you can say in matching the quality of the Al Ali players on paper, that would have been Jonathan Silva. Two caps for Argentina, Sporting Club de Portugal, or more popularly known as Sporting Lisbon. He spent a substantial period of his career there and in La Liga, while but that's as good as it gets because many of them they have played in more modest leagues in Europe, whether it's in Greece or Azerbaijan or even in the lower divisions in Spain. But they all still had the football brain, the technique, the know-how to play against Al Ali. And Cisco chose them because they could do the job. Arif Aiman hasn't been match fit, so it will be too much of a risk to throw him on the right wing. Then Afiq Faisal, who could have contributed as the possibly the only solitary Malaysian-born player, wasn't even fielded in the end because that gap would have been very obvious, and Al Ali could have exploited it. Then you also have Shihan Hazmi, who is almost as equal to Zubiai, who is usually chosen for the ACLE games. But I think Cisco's thinking is pretty clear. Against these type of opponents, only the very best players who can play will do. That meant even sending on Yago, even on sending on Manu Hidalgo, and a few others, or Aka Exete, because their football brains would be able to cope against Al Ali. But even then, the very best of the football brains from Johor still pales a lot compared to Al Ali. This is the major first takeaway in the Southern Tigers' narrow defeat to the defending Asian club champions. Then, secondly, you can say the intensity that Johor face against their Saudi opponents is at a very different level. It's a level that they have dreamt of playing for the longest time. I think even the region of Johor, Tunku Ismail Ibrahim, had spent decades or many years waiting for this moment to have finally come. It has come, it has gone, and it has been a very valuable lesson for everybody involved. But it's also pretty clear that reaching this level means that there's still a different hurdle to overcome. Al Ali, even if you take away those big name players from whether it's Mendy or Mahrez or Kessie or Galeno, those guys who contributed to the win, they still have established Saudi international players. They still have decent quality imports who would hold more than a candle to JDT's best, the very best that JDT could offer for the evening. And that is a massive gap in terms of not just the spending power, but also the fitness, the training, the level of opponents that Al Ali play, where they will have probably played not just your Al Hilal, where they had a number of former top flight players, but also Cristiano Ronaldo's Al Nassr, and also other competent Saudi league teams in their domestic league. In contrast, if you look at Johor, who were they playing almost every week prior to this? With all due respect to the rest of the Liga Super Malaysia, the intensity is not there. Then you talk about your ASEAN Club Championship. In many of the games, the intensity was also not there. And many a time, Cisco also fielded second string players to see whether they could cope to a certain level of competitive football that would be needed for games like against Al Ali. Very few passed. Very few like Manu Hidalgo passed the test and could be relied upon to do the job. Then you have your Champions League Elite East Zone League stage. The J League teams have been very competitive, have given very good fight, provided that they fielded their strongest 11, provided that their focus was also on the competition, which usually was the case, except against Vissel Kobe, where Kobe decided to field a second string team against JDT on the first day of Lunar New Year. But still, when they chose to compete, even in Johor, they were more than competitive. But what about the Chinese clubs? What about, Buriram, Melbourne City? They will provide a fight. But with all due respect to Melbourne City of Australia and Buriram of Thailand, they are not exactly at the same level as Al-Ahli. If JDT had not been playing Al-Ahli, Melbourne City would have struggled. Buriram would also have struggled if their priority wasn't on regaining or maintaining their Thai domestic dominance. That they will also have struggled because these players from Al Ali who have that extra edge in terms of high level experience and exposure, that extra edge in the way how they play, this is where you can see that Al that Al Ali eventually, even with 10 men, they were down to 10 men for more than a half. But their quality, their ability to find the spaces to stretch Johor to the max on those few players, they make the big difference. Really, that big a difference. The way Galeno scored the goal, JDT could defend and figure out how to close the gap for all they want, but there were limits. And this is a lesson. This is not just for JDT, also for particularly Buriram United, the rest of Southeast Asia who could be watching. Never mind JDT Buriram, Persib Bandung would have also struggled. Lion City Sailors would have crumbled. Or even, I mean, Bangkok United could have struggled, will have struggled also. Because in Southeast Asia as a whole, the level of intensity and approach compared to the Saudis, never mind your J League, is really different. Especially the investment of the players, the commitment to spend. Even with Saudi recently announcing a few cuts in their budget, especially in sports, but still currently, Al Ali have shown that with the right investment, with the right coaching, with the right approach, Southeast Asia has a massive gap, massive, that they need to close. Now, then I already talked about the squad quality, you have talked about the depth. Then we talk about the technical and physical aspects. Technically, on even on the pitch for at least a good 60 minutes, JDT were on par even when they were behind, a little slightly behind Al-Ahli. But something became quite obvious after this at least 65th minute or even 75th minute mark. Johor's level actually dipped quite a bit. They were still giving their all, but you can tell that there was a dip. There was a little dip. And our Ali were, with their quality that they also had the freshness of playing at home, and they utilized that to their advantage. So really fair play to Al Ali for being able to make use of the advantage, being able to make use of their quality in spite of being one man down. But for Johor, after this game, where do they go from there? Definitely, they still want to try to crack to match what they have achieved this season, reaching the quarterfinals, maybe even push to a semi-final if possible. But what is very clear is there's a massive gulf in ability in standards. And it's also pretty clear that even in spending wise, for all the complaints that maybe rival Malaysian clubs have on JDT, but when JDT look at the wider Asia, especially in the quarterfinal stage, there's a huge gulf as well. This is JDT, this is Al-Ali. And this gap that we are talking about is not something that can be done overnight. And JDT cannot be that reckless in their spending. So they have to play smart. And they have been quite smart in their spending, in their player recruitment as well. Playing within the rules, playing also to ensure that they have the quality that they needed to at least compete to be among the best eight clubs so far. But it's the next hurdle that they have to overcome. It's going to be very massive because Johor cannot just simply empty the coffers just to attract the stars, only to end up with that usual problem. Malaysian League games, they are more like training games disguised as competitive league matches or cup matches to fulfill the domestic requirements, to train or to warm up, limber up for 90 minutes for a different type of game that would require greater intensity, greater focus, more intelligent running, and a very different game plan compared to in Malaysia or even in Southeast Asia where they could dominate possession, they could just try to pass their way or poke their way through their weaker opponents where they face more often than not. So this part on JDT wanting to compete closer to Al Ali is going to be quite more difficult because the gap is there in spending, the gap is there in the level of intensity and competitiveness. I mean, the Thais could say that they are more competitive than the Malaysian league, but as I mentioned earlier, you throw in Buriram to play Al Ali, same outcome or worse. This is not an easy fight. Johor, Cisco Munoz, his coaching staff, and all the players who were involved from the league phase to this game tonight, they now realize that there's still a certain level to overcome. East Asia probably slightly easier now. They had already conquered the AFC Cup 11 years ago, 10 years ago, but this is a different level now. They are definitely not going to be satisfied, but the weakness of the Malaysian league will be a very difficult situation because you cannot be asking Johor in mid-season ahead of the ACLE quarterfinals to try to find friendly games, say against Cristiano Ronaldo's Al Nassr, just to figure out how they play. Playing friendly games is not going to be a substitute to how these quality teams are really going to show up on the actual competitive setting. It's very different. So it's not just JDT who need to figure out how to close the gap between them and the rest of Asia. Perhaps, and this is really not going to be easy for many of the Malaysian clubs, to find a way to stretch to ensure that it does not become a procession until when they really need to play and they realize that the intensity, the effort is a lot more than what they had been used to for too long a time. So I would say that overall, these are the big lessons that we all can take from how Johor had performed in the ACLE in spite of a very, you can say, this season, a very uncompetitive league where the usual suspects still fight for number two, Selangor, Kuching City, and rumors of Terengganu possibly dropping out or maybe one team coming back, the uncertainty and the usual issues that plague that it has caused for the round table. But beyond that, how to be as competitive as Johor do, and for Johor, how to compete regularly and ensure that the players could actually reach a standard where by the time they play Al-Ahli, they know how to handle, as though it's just, yeah, this opponent is difficult, but able to handle. They show that they could handle against those teams, but possibly not enough yet at this moment. So I think in all those lessons drawn from that single defeat, it shows a lot more things about not just about Johor Darul Takzim, the limitations that they have when facing against Asia's best, but also the massive limitations Southeast Asia football and especially in the Malaysian Super League that they could offer for JDT. And this is not an easy solution, not an easy answer for anyone in Malaysian football to give. So it's a really it throws up more questions. Given now that we know that JDT do need a certain level of intensity, I wouldn't say preparation. It's not about the preparation, the intensity, the fitness, the know-how to play a very different game when facing such a level of opponents. And you are not talking about friendly game. It's a competitive game that we saw. The type of competition that JDT always relishes to play finally got it, but also exposes massive shortcomings in both JTT in their dream to continue to climb up in Asia, but also the inability of the Malaysian Super League to provide that level of competitiveness to keep the players from ensuring that they at least have certain better foundations before preparing against your Al Hilals or even your J1 clubs or the K League clubs or even the Chinese Super League clubs or even their ASEAN Al Clasico opponents Buriram and other challenges that could come in next season's AFC Champions League elite campaign.